The Gospels, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are extraordinary, of course, because they talk about Jesus, the God of the universe, come as a man, but they're also extraordinary as works of literature, as works of history, as works of art. Now, the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we call those the synoptic Gospels. And we say that because the three of them are pretty similar. Each one is looking at the life and work and ministry of Jesus from a slightly different perspective, but for the most part, they're similar. And there's a reason for that. The first of those Gospels that was written was probably the Gospel of Mark. Now, Mark, as many people know, was written by a man by the name of John Mark. John Mark shows up a number of times in the New Testament. As a matter of fact, he starts out working for the Apostle Paul, but John Mark has a moment where he kind of gets a little scared, loses his nerve a little bit, and abandons the group. Well, Paul just can't seem to forget that. And so when John Mark again wants to be a part of the group, Paul says no. Well, Barnabas, who is related to John Mark, wants very much for John Mark to have a second chance. Paul says no. This actually turns out to be one of the great blessings. God sometimes works even in things that don't seem to be a blessing. What do I mean by that? Well, this ends up becoming a split between Paul and Barnabas. They were a dynamic duo, so now Barnabas decides to take John Mark with him and to go and spread the gospel, and Paul then brings Silas with him. Sometimes you'll see his name as Silvanus in the New Testament. Why is this relevant? Well, not only does this double their efforts, but perhaps the most important thing that happens as a result of this is that the Apostle Peter will eventually take John Mark under his wing, because John Mark will become a disciple of Peter. Now, why is that relevant? The reason why that's relevant is that the Gospel of Mark is written by a man who was not an eyewitness to Jesus, but he's telling stories that an eyewitness saw. Peter. One of the interesting things about Mark, and a lot of scholars now are beginning to refer to the Gospel of Mark as really the Gospel of Peter, because these stories tell us things that happen that only the Apostle Peter would have known. Because there are a lot of moments where Peter, James, and John are taken into the secret rooms with Jesus where the healing takes place. What's interesting about this is that Peter tells the story in a way you would imagine Peter to do so. He tells the story with lots of action. And the stories are short, but full of dynamic action. But there's another thing that happens, and that is the Gospel of Mark is incredibly hard on Peter. A lot of the stories in Mark make Peter look like kind of a blundering fool sometimes. Well, there's a very good reason for that. The Gospel of Mark is hard on Peter because Peter is hard on Peter. Well, that affects Matthew and Luke because it's very clear when you read the Gospels of Matthew and Luke that they have a copy of the Gospel of Mark with them. And if we had by any chance lost the Gospel of Mark, thank the Lord we didn't, much of what is in the Gospel of Mark would have survived because it ends up in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. But years later, as a matter of fact, maybe as late as 90 AD, John, a very old man at this point, writes the Gospel of John. He's writing this gospel perhaps 60 years after Jesus has died and has been buried and resurrected and has ascended into heaven. But he has so much experience, and he has such a view from this perspective. All of his friends have been killed. And not just killed horrifically for the gospel. The only reason why John hasn't been killed is because they can't seem to figure out how to do so, so they finally exile him. But the Gospel of John is many people's favorite Gospels. And I want to maybe make a case for why that is. One is, of course, this incredible perspective he brings. But the other reason is John is writing his gospel in the city of Ephesus. Ephesus is the epicenter of the intellectual happenings of the Roman and Greek world. This is where Greek philosophy is everywhere. And John uses the language of the Greek philosophers like Plato throughout his gospel. He opens his gospel in perhaps the most poetic moment in the entire New Testament. He writes, "In the beginning was the Word." That word is logos. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him, and I love this, was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the light was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. It's a poem almost. It's so spectacularly beautiful, hearkening back to Genesis 1, but it's also making a very strong reference to a philosophical idea that permeates the New Testament, and that is the philosophical works of a philosopher named Plato. So I want to call this lecture Plato's Fingerprints on the New Testament. I don't think it's an exaggeration to argue that if one doesn't fully grasp the work of Plato, one can't really get some of the nuances of marvelous books such as the Gospel of John or the Epistle of Hebrews. Let me explain the philosophical idea that especially affected the early Christians, and that is the idea of the idea. Now, imagine for a moment the chair that I'm assuming you're sitting on, the chair I'm sitting on, or the chair you can see on your screen. What is it about that chair that makes you realize it's a chair? Is it that it looks like a chair? Because I don't know if that really works, because I've seen an awful lot of chairs that don't look like chairs. Is it because it has 4 legs? Well, some chairs have 3 legs. Some chairs have no legs. Is it because you sit on it? Is it its function? Perhaps I sit on a stool or I sit on a stump. Are they both chairs? What is it about a chair that would make my little grandson or granddaughter walk in and know, without having been told, that's a chair? Well, Plato tackled that very idea with an idea that he invents the word for, idea. Let's talk about what I mean by that. If you walk into a room and there's nothing in the room except for a chair, Plato would argue that there are actually at that moment two chairs. There's the physical chair, the chair you could sit on, the chair you could pick up, you could throw it, you could touch it, you could do whatever you wanted with it. But there's another chair in the room, and that's this chair, the idea of a chair. What he also will sometimes call the form of a chair. But then the fun part is this: which is the real chair? Is it the physical chair that I could sit on, that I can see, that I can touch? Or is it the idea? Plato's going to argue that the real chair is the idea. And here's how he's going to explain that. If you put that chair in a room and you leave it in that room and you come back 1,000 years later into that room, assuming the chair hasn't disintegrated, that chair is still going to be one chair. It can't recreate itself. It can't improve itself. It's just what it is. But if I have the idea of a chair, I could invent other chairs. I could redesign the chair. I could build other chairs. I could make copies of the chair, because this is the real chair. Now, Plato then is going to expand that, because he could say, what about my house? There's a house, and then there's the idea of a house. And it's the idea that's the real house. What about me? Am I real, or am I the idea that someone had? And I could keep going back according to Plato and imagine the world. Is the world real? Is the physical world real? Or is it really just, as he would put, a shadow of the idea that someone had? What about the universe? The whole universe. Is it real, or is it just the shadow of an idea that someone had? Well, Plato is never going to be able to say, like we might say, well, yes, someone had the idea of it, and that's God. Plato just can't quite get there. He's never going to get there. But we would. We would imagine that everything that we see had to have had someone who had the idea of it. And it's the idea that's truly real. And he's going to call that the Logos, the Word. So when John begins his gospel, in the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was the Logos. He's saying in the beginning was an imagination that thought of everything. And everything that you see, he thought of. Everything you see is just a shadow of what the Logos, of what this man named Jesus thought of. Now, why is that relevant? Why is that relevant at all? And why did that capture the imagination of Christians, even in the New Testament, going all the way up even to today? Well, Plato tried to explain his idea of reality in a parable. And he explains this in a book called The Republic. And he explains it this way. Imagine for a moment a cave, and I've given you a picture of the cave. And everyone who is alive from birth has been chained at the bottom of the cave. We've got chains on our necks, chains on our hands and legs, and all we can see is the back wall of a cave. Now behind us, there's a fire, which means that we can see something on the wall of the cave. We can see shadows. And behind us, there may be people functioning, doing things, but we can't see them. We can hear them, but we can't see them, but we see their shadows. Plato would say that we who only see the shadows, would assume the shadows are real. In the same way, he would say that what we see as the physical world, we think those are real, even though those are just shadows of the imagination of God or imagination of somebody else. And not only that, some of the people who are out behind us feel sorry for the rest of us who are staring at the wall. And so they decide to make puppet shows for us because that will entertain us. And so they cut out pictures of cows and pigs and make all kinds of stories. And we see those shadows and they become almost real to us, and the stories become almost real to us. Now, just for a moment though, imagine that you have a sense that despite the fact that I could see all of this in front of me, you have a sense that there's more to the world than what you see. And so suddenly you decide to do something that really shocks the people around you. You decide to break your chains. You break the chains on your neck, you break the chains on your arms and legs, which turn out to be not that hard to break. You stand up and you turn around. What do you see? Well, you're going to see a fire, but it's going to be bright and it's going to be blinding. Plato's going to argue that all truth, when you first encounter it, is disorienting and blinding. But eventually, your eyes adjust to it. And suddenly you realize there really is more to the world than you realized. And maybe you even notice, oh, there's a way out of the cave. So you work your way out of the cave. You exit the cave. You come out, and there's this giant orange ball in the sky. And this is a new truth. It's disorienting. It's blinding. So at first you can't see, but eventually your eyes adjust to it. You see what are trees and grass and animals, so much more to the world than you see. Plato's going to call you, because you have decided to venture out to see that there's more to the world than one can see, he's going to call you a philosopher. Now imagine for a moment, then you want to go back to your friends who are down at the bottom of the cave and say, guys, you're not going to believe this, but there's more than we thought there was. There's fire, and there are beautiful trees, and there's a sun in the sky. What are they going to think of you? They're going to think you're crazy. As a matter of fact, they may just do to you what we always do to prophets and to figures who recognize that there are possibilities beyond our imagination. We often persecute them. Sometimes we ignore them. Sometimes we kill them. Now, is it even possible, if you decide, I just want to go back to my life looking at shadows, is it even possible to just put the chains back on and stare at the shadows? No. Plato's going to argue, once you've seen the truth, you've been set free. You can't go back because you know that there's more to the world than you can see. This is an idea that will transform the world. I personally will argue that aside from the view of one God, this may be the most revolutionary idea of the Western world. And that is the idea of the idea that what we see is just a shadow of someone who had an imagination, who thought of that. And that will affect everything. It makes me wonder sometimes when I think of how we live our lives, watching screens, watching our TV screens, movie screens, whether we're not just like those people who are staring at shadows. We're watching the imagination of somebody else, thinking what we're seeing is a reality. But you know what? They're just shadows. And we're being fooled, and so many people are content just to sit there and stare at shadows. But do we even know what's real anymore? This is going to be the message of Christianity, that there is a reality bigger, brighter, more amazing than what we even believed. And it's called Jesus. It's called Jesus. And it's not the shadow plays that we've seen. So what's the big deal about this? Well, this is going to affect how we read the New Testament. But let me show you a good example of how this literally has affected the world. I want to show you this picture that you see right now. And here's a beautiful, very typical medieval painting of the Nativity. You could find a picture like this in so many medieval churches. You have the angels, you have Mary, you have Jesus, you have Joseph there off in the back. One of the things you probably notice is that Mary's enormous. So actually is baby Jesus. And everyone else is really tiny. Is that because the artist here is a terrible artist? No. It's actually because the artist is trying to indicate value. In medieval paintings, the bigger the object, the more important. The most important person in this picture, according to the artist, would be Mary. So she's humongous. But is it real? Is this a very realistic painting? Hardly. But something happens right there toward the end of the medieval period into a new period that we call the Renaissance. What causes that? A discovery, a rediscovery of the writings of Plato, Aristotle, Homer. And suddenly these ideas start coming back to us. The idea of the idea, that there is power in the human imagination. There's power in imagination even. And so in just the shortest amount of time, you'll see a nativity scene that looks like this. Look at this, beautiful. I love this. It's by Gerrit van Honthorst, and it's called The Adoration of the Child. Notice how realistic it looks. It almost could be a photograph. It just has emotion to it. Everything is proportionate. Well, one of the things that has happened is that the artist realizes that the picture is just a shadow of his or her idea. So he or she could make it how he wants with his or her distinct signature. And they will even begin to sign the pictures to say, this is my work. Notice here, two images that are very close to each other. You have a picture from 1450, and in a very short amount of time, you have this Caravaggio. And again, see, there's depth, there's emotion, and it's extraordinary. And you look at a Caravaggio and you say, that is clearly a Caravaggio. Well, that's the power of an idea. That's the power of the idea that the human imagination can do a lot of great things. Here's another one where you have Rembrandt and van Honthorst together and painting at about the same time. But notice they're very different in style, both masterpieces. But both of them also are distinctly signatures of the artist. They're making creations that are a shadow of their own ideas. This is the kind of idea that's going to affect the entire Western world, in particular the New Testament. Because from here on out, even the New Testament writers are going to use this language. I'll give you a good example. Of course, I've already read 1 John 1. In the beginning was the Logos. Now that word Logos that we translate as the Word is also the word where we get logic. So in other words, in the beginning was the ultimate logic, the ultimate mind that thought of everything. Now, in Greek thought, the Logos is always one side of a coin of mythos, which is story. So really what John is saying is, in the beginning was the ultimate mind, the ultimate storyteller. And the ultimate mind thought of everything and then made everything. that is a powerful idea that is perhaps even more powerful when we realize how this would have resonated with John's first audience. But notice also, I want to go to Hebrews. The author of Hebrews, and we're not sure who wrote Hebrews. A lot of people would like to attribute it to Paul. There's some traditions that will attribute it to Barnabas or Apollos. Truth is, we don't know. Whoever it was, though, was well-versed in Plato. And he said things such as this in Hebrews 8. They serve at a sanctuary that, and talking about the priests here on earth, they serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. In other words, the sanctuary on earth and the temple on earth is not real. It's just a shadow of the real sanctuary that's in heaven. As a matter of fact, he'll even go so far as to say the sacrificial lamb. That was not the real sacrifice. It was a shadow of the real sacrifice to come. We think in these terms all the time. So it seems strange to us to even have to point it out. And yet this is such a radical idea that's going to be sprinkled throughout the New Testament. That we have a high priest. The high priest that serves, well, that high priest isn't even real. It's just a shadow of the ultimate high priest that is Jesus. Now, why is this relevant? Well, this is relevant because when we get to the New Testament, it's important for us to remember that there are influences. Obviously, the biggest one is the Holy Spirit. Also, the Old Testament is an enormous influence. But the writers of the New Testament were very aware that the people they were writing to were coming from a perspective of philosophy. And they were not afraid to sprinkle that into their writing, their letters, their gospels, to help us understand. And I think that that actually is a beautiful thing. And by the way, if you think Plato is really just a little too out there, and you think a chair is just a chair because you can feel the chair, see the chair, sit on the chair, well, you know what? You would really like Plato's pupil, Aristotle, because he said, I appreciate, Mr. Plato, what you've said, but as far as I can see, a chair is just a chair. So go find a nice comfortable chair and sit on it, whether it's a real chair or whether it's just the idea of a chair.